In July 1981, a 24-year-old woman went missing in Birmingham, England. With limited forensic tools at the time, the case went cold until a breakthrough came decades later. Nova Welsh was born in Jamaica in 1957. When Nova turned 10, her mother, Lorna, made the difficult decision to move to the United Kingdom with her two daughters. Lorna wanted to give her girls a better life and more opportunities, even though it meant leaving behind the familiarity and comfort of their home in Jamaica. At the age of 16, Nova met Osmond Bell, a young man who quickly captured her heart. Their connection was immediate, and despite their youth, they decided to take their relationship seriously. They made the bold choice to live together. Their love seemed strong in the beginning, and 2 years later, they welcomed their first child, Jonathan. For years after Jonathan's birth, they had another son, whom they named Lee. The family appeared happy to the outside world, and Nova took great pride in being a mother. However, beneath the surface, their relationship began to deteriorate. The affection and connection they once shared slowly faded away, replaced by tension and resentment. Arguments became more frequent, and soon domestic violence entered their home. Osmond reportedly began physically abusing Nova, controlling her movements, and threatening her life if she ever tried to leave. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly volatile, leaving Nova emotionally drained and fearful for her safety. Unable to carry the burden alone, Nova confided in her younger sister, sharing the pain and fear she endured. She expressed how unhappy she had become and how much she longed for peace. Eventually, Nova decided she could no longer live under such circumstances. She ended her relationship with Osmond, determined to find happiness again. After some time, Nova met a man named Wayne Newby. Hoping to start fresh, she allowed herself to fall in love again. Wayne began visiting her home, and their relationship blossomed into something that gave her hope. But this new chapter in her life angered Osmond deeply. His jealousy and violent behavior worsened, and Nova found herself once again surrounded by danger, unaware that an even darker fate awaited her. On July 27, 1981, failed to show up for work. Days went by, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Her disappearance was sudden and without explanation. It was Nova's best friend who first noticed something was wrong. She called Nova several times, hoping to hear her familiar voice, but every call went unanswered. Growing uneasy, she decided to go to Nova's apartment to check on her personally. When she arrived at the apartment, she found the door locked. She knocked several times, calling out Nova's name, but there was no response. The silence inside was unsettling. At first, she thought perhaps Nova had traveled abroad without telling anyone, but something did not add up. Hanging on the clothesline outside were freshly washed clothes, an odd detail that made her realize something was terribly wrong. On August 9th, unable to shake her worry, she went to the police station and officially reported Nova missing. 2 weeks after Nova's disappearance, the police began a formal search. They reached out to Osmond Bell, hoping he could provide information about her whereabouts. Osmond claimed that he had not seen Nova in days and suggested that she might have left for America with her new boyfriend, Wayne. Meanwhile, Nova's 2 sons were staying with him, unaware of the tragedy that was unfolding. Then, 3 days after the missing person report was filed, a strange letter surfaced. It was handed to Nova's best friend, who quickly turned it over to the police. The handwriting appeared to belong to a woman, but the identity of the writer was unknown. On August 18th, a neighbor called the police to report a strong, foul odor that had begun spreading through the area. The smell seemed to be coming from Nova's apartment upstairs. Responding officers broke the lock and entered the home to investigate. The stench was overpowering, leading them to a cupboard located under the stairs. The door to the cupboard was locked, but the lock appeared to have been tampered with. A piece of chewing gum was oddly used to keep it sealed. When the officers finally opened the cupboard, they were met with a horrifying sight. Inside was the decomposing body of a woman wrapped in a blanket. The body was soon identified as belonging to Nova. She was wearing a nightgown, and despite the state of decay, her features were still recognizable. The scene was heartbreaking and disturbing, The police immediately called for an ambulance, and Nova's body was taken for an autopsy. According to the post-mortem report, she had lost her life due to pressure applied to her neck, indicating that she had been strangled. The piece of chewing gum from the cupboard lock was carefully collected as evidence. While the world searched for Nova, she had been lying lifeless inside her own home. Osmond emerged as the prime suspect. He was arrested and held in custody for 4 days, during which he was questioned repeatedly about Nova's demise. Osmond maintained his innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with it. With no solid evidence linking him directly to the case, the police were forced to release him. The investigation continued for some time, but with no new leads or breakthroughs, the case eventually went cold. In 2016, cold case investigators began reviewing older unsolved cases, hoping that advancements in forensic science might finally bring long-awaited answers. Among these cases was the tragic case of Nova, whose end had remained a haunting mystery for more than 3 decades. By this time, genetic testing had advanced significantly since the 1980s, offering new possibilities for uncovering evidence that had once seemed useless. The investigators revisited the materials collected from the original crime scene, determined to find something that could point to the perpetrator. During their review, the investigators made a crucial discovery. DNA testing on the piece of chewing gum used to seal the cupboard door where Nova's body was found revealed a match to Osmond Bell. The same DNA profile was also identified on the anonymous letter that had been sent to Nova's best friend, an attempt to shift suspicion toward Wayne, the man Nova had recently begun dating. The DNA evidence was described as having a 1,000,000 to 1 chance of belonging to anyone else, leaving no doubt about the connection. Following the discovery, Bell was arrested in 2016 and charged in connection with Nova's demise. After years of waiting, the case finally went to trial at Birmingham Crown Court in 2017. The court heard that Bell had ended Nova's life in a fit of rage after learning about her new relationship. The prosecutors explained that in the aftermath of the crime, he had tried to mislead the investigators by sending a forged letter, pretending to be someone else, and suggesting that Wayne was responsible. The details painted a picture of a jealous and violent man desperate to conceal his guilt. Testimony during the trial revealed that Nova and Bell had continued living together even after their separation, but their relationship had become deeply toxic. Witnesses recounted how Bell had repeatedly threatened to end Nova's life if she ever left him. This threat, once dismissed as an angry outburst, took on a chilling weight as the evidence unfolded. Despite the prosecution's efforts, the jury found Bell guilty of manslaughter, concluding that he had not planned the crime but acted in anger. In March 2017, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. After 36 long years, justice had finally been served. Nova's mother Lorna expressed a deep sense of relief and sorrow as she gave her statement to the press. She said, "Finally, after 36 long years, Nova can rest in peace. The family can now have closure knowing the person who took Nova's life has been brought to justice. I would sincerely like to thank everyone involved in bringing this case to court." A police officer who had worked on the case also reflected on its significance. He stated, "With the advances in technology assisting our old investigations, we can bring people to justice no matter how long after the offense has happened." In August 1660, a 70-year-old man set out on a short walk in Campden, England, and never returned. With no body and mounting suspicion, the disappearance spiraled into one of the most shocking criminal cases of the 17th century. William Harrison was born around the year 1590. As an adult, William entered into service under Lady Campden, where he worked as a steward and estate manager. This position placed him in charge of overseeing the smooth running of her lands and financial affairs, a role that demanded both precision and honesty. Within the community, William was known as a man of strong moral standing. His work often required him to travel, collect rents, and mediate disputes between tenants, tasks that could easily lead to mistrust or resentment if handled poorly. By the year 1660, William was nearing 70 years old, an age when most would have retired from demanding responsibilities. Nevertheless, he continued to fulfill his role with the same diligence he had shown throughout his life. He lived in Campden with his wife and son, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of village life. On August 16, 1660, William set out on foot to collect rents in the nearby village of Charingworth, a journey of about 2 miles from his home. It was a routine task, one he had undertaken many times before without incident. However, that evening William failed to return home. His wife, increasingly anxious as darkness fell, sent the family servant, John Perry, to look for him along the familiar path. When John did not return by the following morning, William's son Edward joined the search, determined to uncover what had happened to his father. Their search led to a disturbing discovery. Along the route to Charingworth, they found a hat, a shirt, and a neckband belonging to William. The garments were stained with blood, and the hat appeared to have been slashed with a sharp instrument. To those who knew William's habits and cautious nature, it seemed clear that something terrible had occurred. With no sign of his body and only these bloodied remnants, the community feared the worst. Rumors spread quickly through Campden that William's life was ended during his journey. Suspicion soon turned toward John Perry, the servant who had been sent to find his master. Under questioning, John offered a shocking confession. He claimed that he, his mother Joan Perry, and his brother Richard had conspired to rob and slain William. According to his account, they had strangled the elderly steward and dumped his body in a mill pond to conceal their crime. Despite the absence of a body, the confession seemed convincing enough to the local authorities, and all 3 members of the Perry family were arrested and charged. The first trial took place in 1661. During the proceedings, inconsistencies emerged in John's statements, including a false story he had told weeks earlier about being attacked by robbers. His testimony implicated his mother and brother, leading to their conviction for robbery, though no conclusive evidence of slaying was presented. It is believed that Joan and Richard guilty to robbery in hopes of benefiting from the Indemnity and Oblivion Act of 1660, which pardoned certain first-time offenders. Still, questions about the missing body and the truth of John's account lingered. A second trial was convened later that spring, this time charging the Perrys with taking the life of William. By then, John had recanted his earlier confession, claiming that his words were the product of confusion or insanity. Nevertheless, the jury remained unconvinced. Despite the absence of physical proof and John's reversal, all 3 were found guilty and received capital punishment. The verdict was met with both disbelief and grim acceptance among the townspeople. The executions were carried out on Broadway Hill in Gloucestershire. Joan Perry was hanged first, reportedly in an attempt to break any supposed witchcraft spell she might have cast over her sons. Her execution was followed by that of Richard and John, who both maintained their innocence until the end. 2 years after his mysterious disappearance, in 1662, William astonished everyone by returning to England alive. He was older, frail, and marked by the hardships he had endured, yet unmistakably the same William who had vanished on his journey to Charingworth. According to William's own account, he had been kidnapped on the night of his disappearance by 3 horsemen. They had seized him on the road and carried him off against his will, taking him first to the coastal town of Deal. There he claimed he was sold to a ship's captain and transported overseas. His story grew even more extraordinary as he described being sold into slavery in the Ottoman Empire. Forced into servitude, he lived under harsh conditions until the demise of his master provided him with a chance to escape. After his escape, William said he made his way to a seaport, where he managed to stow away on a Portuguese vessel. The ship carried him to Lisbon, where he found temporary refuge before finally securing passage back to England. His return journey was long and dangerous, and it was only after many months that he was able to reach his homeland once more. When he arrived, he was welcomed by astonished neighbors and a deeply shaken family who had mourned him. The revelation that William was alive cast a grim light on the events that had followed his disappearance. The executions of Joan, John, and Richard Perry appeared to be an appalling miscarriage of justice. They had been tried, convicted, and hanged for a crime that had never occurred, their ends resting entirely on John's false confession. The case became one of the most disturbing examples of wrongful conviction in English legal history, raising troubling questions about the reliability of confessions made under pressure. In May 1987, in Hopkins, South Carolina, two hunters stumbled upon a horrifying scene of human remains. With limited forensic tools available at the time, the case quickly went cold, leaving her family without answers until decades later. Patricia Ann Green was born in 1953. She grew up to become a devoted mother who dedicated much of her time and energy to raising her three children. By 1987, Patricia was raising her family in Columbia, South Carolina. At that time, she lived with her three children and her sister in an apartment located on Rice Street, just off Pickens Street. On May 10, 1987, a shocking discovery was made just steps away from the entrance of McEntire Air Base in Hopkins, South Carolina. Two hunters, moving through the area, came across a disturbing sight. What they found would remain with them forever, and in their horror, they quickly contacted law enforcement to report what they had seen. When the police arrived at the scene, they confirmed the hunters' worst fears. The victim was a woman, already deceased. The officers carefully surveyed the area and determined that the woman had been shot multiple times before being left in a culvert. The investigators began piecing together what they could from the scene. They worked to understand how the victim ended up in such a remote and hidden location. While searching the immediate area, the officers noted a small but haunting detail. The woman's shoes were not on her feet. Instead, her untied shoes were found lying nearby on the bank of the ditch, separated from her body. One of the first challenges the authorities were facing was identifying the victim. No identification was recovered at the scene. With no personal belongings or immediate clues at the crime scene, the investigators decided to circulate details of the case locally in the hope that someone might recognize her. Eventually, family members came forward and confirmed the victim was Patricia Ann Green. Years passed without justice, but in the 2000s and 2010s, a new effort emerged. Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott established a cold case squad dedicated to revisiting unsolved cases. This specialized team began reviewing old cases with fresh eyes, determined to apply modern technology to evidence that had once yielded no results. Patricia's case was among those re-examined. The detectives returned to the evidence collected from the crime scene decades earlier. With advances in technology, samples were retested. The new analysis provided investigators with a crucial breakthrough. The DNA results pointed directly to Philip Johnson, a man already serving multiple life sentences in Sumter County. Johnson had been arrested in 1988 and was known for a string of violent crimes. In March 2017, when the investigators confronted him, he offered details about the crime that only the perpetrator could have known. According to his own account, Johnson admitted that Patricia slain was part of a spree. He told the investigators there was no specific motive, describing her as simply somebody that he shot and slain. The authorities believe that he ended two women's lives in Sumter County before he ended Patricia's life, and then went on to take the lives of two more women afterward. Johnson remains incarcerated at Kirkland Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. Reflecting on the case, law enforcement emphasized the importance of persistence. The authorities stated that this case serves as a reminder to victims' families that they are never forgotten. Cold case investigators pledged that no matter how much time passes, they will continue to review old files with the latest technology available. For Patricia's family, the wait for answers stretched nearly 30 years, but with the confession and DNA confirmation, they finally received the truth about what happened to her. In July 2011, a 16-year-old girl left her home in La Paz, Mendoza province in Argentina, but she never returned. What began as a missing person report quickly unraveled into a web of contradictions, silence, and overlooked evidence. Aldana Celeste Orozco Maturano was born in 1997 in La Paz. She grew up in modest circumstances, raised mainly by her mother and stepfather. By 2011, Aldana was in her second year of high school and had begun to develop her own opinions and dreams. Like many teenagers, she was curious about the world beyond her small town. She expressed a desire for independence and talked about finding a way to build a better future for herself and her family. Her teachers saw her as a thoughtful student who worked hard and rarely got into trouble. On July 8, Aldana was last seen leaving her home, reportedly to visit a friend. It was a normal afternoon and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, Aldana never returned home. As hours turned into days, her family grew increasingly anxious, and what began as mild concern soon turned into panic. When all attempts to locate her failed, they decided to file a missing person report with the local authorities. The initial investigation offered little clarity. The statements given to the police were inconsistent and confusing. Aldana's stepfather told the officers that she had been acting rebellious and suggested that she might have left voluntarily. His account implied that she had run away in search of freedom or independence. But this explanation did not align with what others knew about her. Aldana's friends and classmates rejected the runaway theory. They insisted that she had no boyfriend, no savings, and no plans to leave home. She had shown no signs of distress and had even made plans for school activities later that week. To them, it was unthinkable that she would vanish without telling anyone. These contradictions deepened the mystery surrounding her disappearance, but the investigators appeared reluctant to dig deeper. Within weeks, the case lost momentum. The police treated Aldana's disappearance as a runaway incident rather than a possible kidnapping, which limited the resources and urgency devoted to finding her. No search teams were organized and no public alerts were issued. For the family, this lack of action was devastating, as every passing day made hope feel more distant. In the months that followed, the neighbors began recalling troubling details from before Aldana went missing. Several reported hearing loud arguments and shouting coming from her home in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Some witnesses also claimed that they had seen unknown men visiting the house at odd hours, raising suspicions about possible connections to trafficking or criminal activity. Despite these disturbing accounts, the authorities failed to follow up on key leads. Testimonies were overlooked, and evidence was never properly examined. As a result, Aldana's case gradually faded from public attention. What began as a missing person investigation soon turned into a cold case, leaving behind unanswered questions. Over the years, her face appeared on missing children campaigns and Interpol databases, keeping her name alive long after the local authorities had closed the file. Activists and independent organizations often cited her case as a symbol of the failures in Argentina's handling of missing person investigations, especially those involving minors from low-income families. For nearly a decade, her family lived between faint hope and painful uncertainty, never knowing whether Aldana was alive or deceased. In December 2020, the long-dormant case suddenly resurfaced when the National Gendarmerie conducted a raid on the home of Aldana's mother and stepfather. The operation led to both being arrested and detained on suspicion of involvement in human trafficking. The investigators alleged that Aldana's disappearance might have been connected to a broader criminal network that operated by recruiting or coercing minors through family members. Following the arrests, the federal court expanded its investigation into a suspected child trafficking network that allegedly involved the exchange or sale of minors. The authorities began uncovering evidence suggesting that vulnerable families had been targeted by traffickers who promised money, favors, or opportunities in return for handing over children. These revelations painted a grim picture of systemic exploitation that had remained hidden in plain sight for years. Then, in 2021, nearly 10 years after she first vanished, Aldana was found alive in Buenos Aires during a police operation against a human trafficking ring. Aldana had been forced into prostitution from a young age and lived under the constant control of her captors. Her years in captivity were marked by abuse, coercion, and the loss of freedom she had once dreamed of gaining. Her recovery brought renewed national attention and forced Argentina to confront deep-rooted issues within its justice system. Journalists, activists, and citizens began questioning how such a case could have gone unnoticed for so long, and why early warnings had been dismissed. The public outcry demanded accountability for the neglect and corruption that had allowed Aldana's suffering to continue unchecked. In June 1995, a violent crash in Emporia claimed the lives of two young men. One was identified quickly, but the passenger was a complete mystery for decades. On June 26, 1995, 21-year-old Michael Hager gave another young man a lift after a Grateful deceased concert. That day, The two young men shared the road as they traveled through Virginia. At approximately 1:30 p.m., tragedy struck when the vehicle they were in crashed into a pair of trees in Emporia, Virginia. The collision was devastating and claimed both of their lives. They were not wearing seatbelts. The authorities quickly identified the driver as Michael, but the passenger posed a far greater challenge. He carried no identification and no one at the scene knew who he was. Without a name, the passenger became known only by a nickname created from the circumstances of his demise, Grateful Doe. In the days and years that followed, his case became one of the most widely discussed examples of an unknown accident victim. Several belongings found with him were preserved as potential clues. Among them were 2 ticket stubs from the concerts held at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. on June 24 and June 25, 1995. Another significant discovery was a handwritten note. It was addressed to Jason and signed by 2 individuals identified as Caroline O. and Caroline T. The note included a phone number with a 914 area code, but the full contact details were incomplete. Despite efforts to trace it, the investigators were unable to link the number to anyone connected to the case, and the identities of the 2 Carolines remain unknown. In addition to the note and concert stubs, the investigators documented several personal details that stood out. He had a homemade star tattoo inked onto his left arm, a beaded necklace, and other distinctive possessions that reflected his lifestyle. Unfortunately, despite the detectives' best efforts, the case went cold. In January 2015, after 2 decades, the story of Grateful Doe took an unexpected turn from across the globe. A Reddit user in Queensland stumbled upon the case while researching unsolved mysteries. Fascinated by the details, the user began gathering more information and later shared it on Imgur. The post included specifics such as the cause of demise, the clothing the man had been wearing, the items found with him, and several of the facial reconstructions that had been created over the years. The Reddit user's intention was simple: to circulate the information in the hopes that someone might recognize the unidentified young man. That effort soon proved successful. A message arrived from someone who had seen the reconstruction and believed he recognized the victim. He explained that the face looked strikingly similar to one of his old roommates from Illinois, a young man he remembered by the name of Jason. He described him as a free-spirited, hippie surfer type, which matched the image long associated with Grateful Doe. Not long after this recognition, the case began to grow in public attention. The story of Grateful Doe spread quickly, catching the interest of mainstream media outlets. Soon, it went viral across social media platforms, reaching a much wider audience than ever before. It was through this growing wave of exposure that the case finally reached someone very close to the truth. On Facebook, a woman named Margarita Evans came across the photos and reconstructions. To her, the young man in the images was immediately recognizable. She identified him as her son, Jason Callahan, who had disappeared years earlier. Determined to confirm what she already knew in her heart, the authorities arranged for a DNA test in early 2015. The results confirmed the match. Grateful Doe was indeed Jason Patrick Callahan. Jason was born on April 18, 1976. During his late teenage years, Jason was living in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. A key part of Jason's life was his passion for music. He was a devoted fan of the American rock band, the Grateful Deceased, whose following spanned generations and created an entire culture of community, freedom, and travel. Jason's admiration for the band went beyond casual interest. It became an important part of who he was, shaping his lifestyle and the choices that would eventually alter the course of his life. In June 1995, when he was just 19 years old, Jason made the decision to leave his home and follow them on their tour that summer. The band's concerts were more than shows. They were gatherings where fans came together in a nomadic community, traveling from city to city in pursuit of music and belonging. Yet, what Jason could not have known was that this decision, taken with excitement and hope, would place him on a path toward danger. The investigators reflected on the case and explained why Jason had gone so long without being identified. A detective noted that Jason's mother had attempted to report him missing, but because of the nomadic lifestyle associated with the community, she was unsure of which jurisdiction should handle the report. As the years passed without word from him, Jason's family came to believe that he had simply chosen to live his life elsewhere. When the truth finally emerged, it was met with mixed emotions. While the identification brought long-awaited closure, the detective admitted to a lingering sadness. He expressed that Jason's case might have been resolved much sooner if the proper missing person report had been filed and directed correctly. At the same time, he acknowledged the power of social media in finally solving the mystery. After 2 decades, Jason Callahan had his name restored, and while the story carried a melancholy weight, the most important fact remained. Grateful Doe was no longer unknown. In October 1983, the body of a 23-year-old man was discovered in Spalding County, Georgia, mutilated with an X carved into his stomach. Decades later, a cold case investigator reopened the file, uncovering old secrets through new witness testimony. Timothy Coggins was born in 1960 and spent his childhood in Spalding County, Georgia. He grew up in a large, close-knit family, surrounded not only by his siblings, but also by cousins who were like brothers and sisters to him. He was one of 8 children in the household with 3 brothers and 4 sisters. Timothy was raised by his mother Viola Dorsey, and his stepfather Robert Dorsey. Music and dancing were among Timothy's greatest joys. He was known for enjoying life, often finding expression through rhythm and movement. For work, Timothy often joined his stepfather in practical trades. He painted, laid bricks, and handled carpentry and plumbing, skills he learned directly from Robert. Timothy also lived in ways that set him apart from many around him. In a community where racial divisions were strongly felt, he socialized openly across racial lines. Many of his friends were white, and he even dated white women. He moved through these interactions without fully realizing the risks they carried in that era and place. Timothy did not know the danger that was waiting ahead of him. In October 1983, tragedy struck when 23-year-old Timothy's life was ended. His body was discovered in a condition that spoke to the violence he endured. He had been stabbed more than 30 times, and the investigators noted a deliberate mutilation. An X had been carved into his stomach, a mark resembling the emblem of the Confederate flag. The brutality of the wounds revealed the deep hatred behind the attack. Further details of the crime painted an even more disturbing picture. Evidence showed that Timothy had been dragged behind a truck before his body was abandoned. His remains were left beneath a large oak tree, a tree that carried its own dark history in the area and was locally known as the Hanging Tree. This location added a chilling weight to the crime. Law enforcement would later conclude that the crime was racially motivated. In the social climate of the time, Timothy's openness in crossing racial boundaries became a dangerous point of contention. His associations, particularly his willingness to date white women, drew the anger of those who sought to enforce segregation through fear and violence. The investigators determined that one of the triggers for the attack was his relationship with a white woman. In the eyes of the suspects, his social choices were considered unacceptable. This, coupled with his broader friendships across racial lines, marked him as a target. His slaying served as a grim warning meant to instill fear in the black community. Despite the savagery of the crime and the clues surrounding it, the case would remain unresolved for decades. In December 2016, more than 3 decades after Timothy's life was taken, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Spalding County Sheriff's Office decided to reopen the case. A cold case investigator revisited the long-dormant file, looking more closely at the evidence and stories that had circulated for years. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to gather fresh witness testimony. Individuals came forward with statements that shed new light on what had happened that October night. Some recalled hearing suspects brag about their involvement, openly admitting to the stabbing. Accounts described the number of stab wounds as being between 28 and 32, closely aligning with the brutality that had been recorded at the crime scene. Witnesses also recalled details about Timothy being dragged behind a truck and about the motivation behind the attack. Consistently, testimony pointed toward the same cause: Timothy's relationships and socializing across racial lines. These statements gave investigators the evidence they needed to move forward. The reinvestigation eventually led to a wave of arrests. 5 individuals were taken into custody: Lamar Bunn, Sandra Bunn, Gregory Huffman, Frankie Gebhardt, and Bill Moore. Among them, Gebhardt and Moore were directly accused of carrying out the crime itself. The others were charged with offenses related to interfering with the investigation. For the first time, accountability seemed possible. The prosecutors argued that Gebhardt and Moore's anger over Timothy's relationship with Gebhardt's girlfriend was the driving force behind everything. Gebhardt was brought to trial, and on June 26, 2018, a Spalding County jury convicted him on multiple counts, including felony slaying, aggravated assault, and concealing a demise. His sentence was life in prison plus 30 additional years. Moore, who was Gebhardt's brother-in-law, chose to plead guilty rather than face trial. On August 16, 2018, he admitted to voluntary manslaughter and concealing the demise of another. For this, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison followed by 10 years of probation, and he was banished from the Griffin Judicial Circuit. Meanwhile, Lamar Bunn, Sandra Bunn, and Gregory Huffman faced charges of obstruction and other lesser crimes, accused of attempting to interfere with the long-overdue investigation. Timothy's brother Tyrone Coggins said his demise took a heavy toll on the family. He said, "We were shocked. We were like, who would hurt this guy? This was Tim. This was the smooth guy, the guy that never bothered nobody, always helped somebody." His sister, Talisa Coggins, remembers her brother Tim as someone who was very sweet and outgoing. She said he was the kind of person who could get along with anybody. His headstone reads, "In loving memory, Timothy Wayne Coggins gone, but never forgotten." In October 1992, a 70-year-old woman of Mill Bay, British Columbia, and her car vanished without a trace. Janet Margaret Staniforth Ferris was born in 1922. She later married Walter Earl Ferris, a man with whom she built a life. Their marriage lasted many years until Walter's passing in 1984. His demise left Janet a widow, yet she continued on, maintaining her role as a mother and adapting to the challenges of life without her husband by her side. Janet and Walter had a son who also resided in Mill Bay, British Columbia. The connection with her son anchored her life in many ways, keeping her tied to her family and community. On October 1, 1992, Janet left her home with the intention of traveling to Alberta for a wedding. It was meant to be a routine trip, one she embarked on alone, but she would never return. When she failed to come back as expected, her family members quickly grew concerned. What began as worry soon turned into fear when there was still no sign of her. Her family, realizing the seriousness of her disappearance, reported her missing to the police. A missing person report was filed, and the authorities took immediate steps to begin tracing her movements. The initial objective was clear: to determine where Janet could have gone and what might have happened during her journey. Through their investigation, the police were able to reconstruct parts of her travel route. They confirmed that Janet had been driving solo to Alberta. Along the way, she had stopped to spend the night at her sister's home in White Rock. The following day, she continued her trip, making a recorded purchase for fuel at the Tappan Esso station, located east of Salmon Arm. After that purchase, Janet vanished. Neither she nor her vehicle were ever seen again. It was as though she had disappeared without a trace, leaving the investigators with only the faint outline of her last known movements. The sudden loss of contact made the situation even more unsettling for her family, who hoped each day for any word of her whereabouts. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an extensive search effort. Highway patrols were conducted in the hopes of finding some sign of her car or her presence along the route. Aerial searches were carried out using helicopters to scan large stretches of road and terrain. Search and rescue volunteers, along with family members, joined in, combing through roadways and surrounding areas where Janet might have been. Despite these efforts, no substantial lead ever emerged. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation offered no breakthrough and eventually went cold. On August 24, 2019, nearly 3 decades after Janet's disappearance, her vehicle was finally recovered from Griffin Lake in British Columbia. The finding was made possible by a 13-year-old boy named Max Warenka. While spending time at Griffin Lake, Max and his mother noticed what appeared to be the outline of a vehicle submerged just off the shore. The sight was unusual and immediately drew their attention. Their curiosity would soon uncover the key to Janet's case. Equipped with a GoPro camera, Max decided to take a closer look. He dove into the lake, maneuvering underwater to capture video footage of the object. The recording clearly showed the shape of an overturned car resting beneath the water's surface. His quick thinking and determination provided tangible proof that something significant had been hidden in Griffin Lake for years. The initial assumption was that the submerged car might have been connected to a 2009 accident known to have occurred in the area. This theory seemed plausible at first glance, given the passage of time and the lack of immediate details. However, questions arose as more people examined the situation more closely. An off-duty officer from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police viewed the discovery and proposed that the vehicle could be tied to an older case. This suggestion shifted the focus of the investigation and prompted further action. It was no longer just a curious find. It might finally solve a mystery that had remained unsolved for decades. A professional dive team was brought in to confirm the car's identity. Divers carefully recovered the license plate from the submerged vehicle, and once it was examined, the truth was revealed. The plate matched Janet's missing car, conclusively tying the discovery at Griffin Lake to her disappearance in 1992. When the vehicle was finally pulled from Griffin Lake, the investigators confirmed that Janet's body was still inside. The grim discovery closed a chapter that had been open for 27 years. While it was heartbreaking to find her in such circumstances, the recovery provided long-awaited answers for those who had lived with uncertainty for decades. The authorities quickly determined that her demise was not considered suspicious. Instead, the evidence suggested a tragic accident. The investigators speculated that Janet may have lost control of her vehicle while driving along the lake road. It was possible that she had swerved to avoid striking an animal or another obstruction, which may have caused her to veer off the road and into the water. Her son, George Ferris, spoke about the family's reaction to the discovery. After so many years of unanswered questions, he expressed a sense of relief at finally knowing what had happened. Although the loss was still deeply painful, the clarity of the discovery offered a measure of peace. The uncertainty had been lifted, and with it came some degree of closure. Janet's remains were respectfully recovered, and arrangements were made for her cremation. Plans were set for her to be interred alongside her husband, Walter Earl Ferris, in Mill Bay. The reunion of her remains with her late husband symbolized the closing of a long and painful separation, both for Janet and for the family who had waited so long for this outcome. George explained that the family had long believed Janet's disappearance was most likely the result of a car accident during her journey to the wedding. Theories within the family included the possibility of a medical emergency, the chance she may have fallen asleep behind the wheel, or the likelihood she had swerved to avoid an animal or sudden obstacle. These possibilities had remained in their minds for years, unanswered until the car's discovery. Above all, George emphasized that the worst part of the ordeal had been the uncertainty of not knowing. In December 1983, a young mother from Richmond went missing. DNA analysis would link the perpetrator to the crime decades later. Marcia Carter was born in 1958. By the time she reached the age of 25, she was already carrying great responsibilities on her shoulders. Marcia was a single mother raising 4 children on her own. While focusing on her role as a mother, Marcia was also involved in a turbulent personal relationship. She had been in an on-and-off relationship with a man named Cheryl Smothers. The connection between them was far from steady, marked by cycles of closeness and distance. Despite the instability, their relationship remained a recurring part of Marcia's life. On the morning of December 7, 1983, Marcia's 3 older sons, whose ages ranged from about 7 to 11 years old, entered their mother's bedroom. What they saw was alarming and confusing. Blood was visible on the mattress, but Marcia herself was nowhere to be found. The absence of their mother immediately set off a wave of fear for the children, who were left without any explanation for the troubling scene. Inside the same room, the boys made another unsettling discovery. Their infant brother, only about 10 months old at the time, was found hiding beneath the bed. The baby's presence in such a vulnerable position only added to the distress of the moment. Faced with fear and uncertainty, The children quickly sought help, running to a neighbor's house to raise alarm about what they had witnessed. The authorities responded quickly once the call for help was made. The police officers arrived at Marcia's home and immediately began an investigation into her disappearance. They examined the disturbing evidence inside the bedroom, carefully noting the blood on the mattress and the condition of the home. Their immediate priority was to determine what had happened to Marcia and to ensure the safety of her children. As the search expanded, the police worked tirelessly to find any clue that might reveal Marcia's whereabouts. Interviews, evidence collection, and local searches were conducted in hopes of uncovering answers. Despite their efforts, Marcia remained missing in those first crucial days. Her disappearance left her children, her community, and the investigators with more questions than answers. It was not until 10 days later that a devastating discovery was made. Marcia's body was found inside the trunk of her own car, which had been abandoned and parked in West Sacramento. The grim discovery confirmed the worst fears of both her family and the authorities. Marcia had been the victim of a violent and tragic end. Even with the recovery of her body, the investigation struggled to move forward. The police sought to understand how Marcia ended up in the trunk of her vehicle, but concrete leads failed to emerge. Without clear evidence pointing to a suspect or a motive, the case lost momentum and ultimately went cold. Starting in 2008, 25 years after the case was opened, the authorities decided to take another look at Marcia's case. Biological samples and DNA evidence that had originally been collected in 1983 were carefully revisited, with the hope that modern testing could reveal what had once gone undetected. For years, the case had remained unsolved, though the investigators had long harbored suspicions about Marcia's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Cheryl L. Smothers. Smothers was a wealthy man who, by that time, had been left wheelchair-bound after a car crash in 1989. His connection to Marcia and the troubled nature of their relationship placed him in the spotlight of suspicion. But it was not until the DNA reanalysis that the investigators believed that they had a breakthrough. The new testing revealed a link between Smothers and the crime. DNA evidence discovered in Marcia's residence tied him directly to the case. With this connection, the prosecutors moved forward, and in 2016, a grand jury formally indicted Cheryl Smothers for ending the life of Marcia. The case finally went to trial on September 20, 2018. The prosecutors presented their evidence to the jury, including the crucial DNA samples that had been identified on Marcia's clothing and within her home. After decades of uncertainty, the courtroom became the stage for long-awaited answers about what had happened to Marcia. By the end of the trial, the jury reached a decisive conclusion. In September 2018, Smothers was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life. For many, the verdict seemed to deliver justice after so many years of unanswered questions. However, the resolution would prove to be far from final. In 2021, the First District Appellate Court overturned Smothers' conviction, dramatically changing the course of the case once again. The court cited serious errors made by Smothers' defense attorney, particularly in handling the complexities of the DNA evidence. Adding to the shock was an unexpected twist. DNA found under Marcia's fingernails was matched to a man named Kevin Sennett, who lived in Wisconsin and had no known connection to Marcia or the events in California. Sennett's name was kept from the jury during the 2018 trial. It is unclear whether the Contra Costa District Attorney will move to retry the case. Kim Everett Kirk was born January 12, 1970, and was one of 3 daughters. She met David Neal Cox through a friend at work around the year 2000, and initially he was a nice guy. They quickly married, and he became a stepfather to Kim's 2 daughters, and the couple went on to have 2 sons together. Cox was a truck driver, but following a back injury and a prescription for painkillers, he left the workforce and qualified for disability. He then became addicted to meth and started abusing Kim. Due to the drugs, his behavior and personality had suddenly changed. At some point, Cox had even gone as far as manufacturing his own meth. In 2009, when her daughter Lindsay confessed to her mother that Cox had been sexually assaulting her for a few years, Kim finally decided to divorce him. But this instilled fear into Kim, and she made plans for her and the kids to take refuge at a women's shelter out of fear that Cox would retaliate. Kim took the children and left and pressed charges against Cox, and when deputies arrived to the home, Cox was arrested for statutory rape, sexual battery, and child abuse. They also found the precursors to make meth. Kim, still deathly afraid of her estranged husband, moved her and the children in with her sister, Christy Simon. While in the county jail, he told other prisoners that if he ever got out, he would kill his wife. However, unable to raise bond money, he remained in jail for 9 months. During that time, he often made threatening phone calls and would tell her he was coming for her. Suddenly, in April 2010, his bond was significantly reduced, allowing him to raise enough funds to get out. The family only learned he had been released when a friend saw him on the street and called Kim. She then went to the Chancery Court and got protective orders against him in Lee, Pontotoc, and Union counties. Now that he was out, he would sometimes drive by her home and point his finger at her and simulate a gun. Then about 7 p.m. on May 14, 2010, tragedy would strike. 12-year-old Lindsay was sitting on the couch while her mom's sister, Christy, was cooking dinner and one of her brothers was playing basketball outside. Her mother, Kim, was in the back of the house preparing a bath for her youngest son. That's when Cox shot through the screen door of the home in Sherman, Mississippi, before barging inside and ordering Lindsay not to move. He then chased her aunt out of the house. He then found Kim and shot her twice. Her youngest son would frantically run to a closet. Meanwhile, Aunt Christy called Kim's parents and told them what was happening. Cox called her parents and told them it was all their fault he was arrested and he had planned to kill all of them. Kim's father and stepmother, Benny and Melody Kirk, then had to serve as negotiators on the phone with Cox. They could hear Cox taunting Kim as she was dying and belittling her and said he wanted to sit there and watch her suffer. Kim was able to talk on the phone briefly to her father while she lay on the floor bleeding to death and said, "Daddy, I'm dying." She was still hanging on to life at midnight. He had barricaded the 4 of them inside the home and physically and mentally tortured the family and told law enforcement he planned to kill the children and then himself. When he stopped talking to law enforcement at 3:23 a.m., officers stormed the house and arrested him. Kim was sadly already deceased during those nearly 9 hours of holding the children hostage. Cox sexually assaulted his stepdaughter, Lindsay, 3 times in front of her dying mother, even as police surrounded the home. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty to capital murder, kidnapping, and several other felonies related to the standoff and was sentenced to death. He then began years of appealing his conviction and sentence. He then made plans to waive his appeals and proceed with the execution, which infuriated Lindsay as she wanted him to sit in prison and reflect on what he did to her and her family. Lindsay has allowed her name to be made public to tell her story. On November 17, 2021, 50-year-old Cox died by lethal injection at the Mississippi State Penitentiary, and Lindsay, now 23, was there to witness it. He became the first Mississippi inmate to be put to death in 9 years. In the days prior to his scheduled execution, Cox made a shocking confession. He said that he had been the one that killed his sister-in-law, Felicia Cox, who was married to his brother. On November 19th, 2 days after his execution, his attorneys hand-delivered a letter in which Cox confessed to the murder and gave details of where her body is located. Felicia had been missing since July 2, 2007, after making a visit to Kim and David Cox's home. Her remains were found where he said they'd be in Pontotoc County on his family's former property. He had been a person of interest in Felicia's disappearance, but authorities had no evidence at the time. Kim's father and stepmother raised Lindsay and her 2 younger brothers after Kim's death, and one of his sons still has fear that he will come after them, even knowing that he is no longer breathing the air that he didn't deserve. Anna Mariah Wilson was born on May 18, 1996 in Littleton, New Hampshire, to Eric and Karen Wilson. She grew up in Kirby, Vermont, and went by Mo and was a gifted multi-sport athlete. She was the captain of her high school soccer team and was a nationally ranked junior skier, placing 3rd in the 2013 U.S. Junior National Championship downhill event. After college, she transitioned from skiing to biking, and at the age of 25, she was a professional bike racer and worked as a demand planner for Specialized. She enjoyed cooking, riding, and traveling, especially to Italy. She recently excelled at gravel racing, a relatively new category of cycling that some consider a hybrid of road cycling and mountain biking. On May 10, 2022, a profile in Bello News referred to her as the winningest woman in the American off-road scene. The next day, May 11, 2022, was preparing to compete in the 157-mile gravel low-coast bike race in Texas. She was staying with a friend in Austin, Texas, while preparing for the upcoming race in Hico. She told her friend she was going for an afternoon swim, but she didn't go along. Cyclist Colin Strickland joined her and the two would have dinner together afterwards. Colin would then drop Mo back at her friend's house. That's where the story takes a horrible turn. Colin's girlfriend, 35-year-old Caitlin Marie Armstrong, was apparently jealous of Mo and Colin's relationship. Armstrong had even confronted Mo before and told her to stay away from Colin. After Colin dropped Mo off, Armstrong would allegedly shoot Mo to death inside of her friend's home. Armstrong had been suspicious of Colin cheating on her with Mo for several months. However, Colin told police that he and Mo were only briefly romantically involved in the fall of 2021, but only while he and Armstrong were temporarily broken up. He said after that, Mo and him remained friends and their relationship became completely platonic and professional. Her loved one said, had no reason to believe that she was romantically involved with anyone when she was killed. 6 days after the murder, police issued a homicide warrant for Armstrong. Following Mo's killing, police located 2 handguns in the home Colin shared with Armstrong, which matched the spent shell casing found at the murder scene. Armstrong's car was also seen on surveillance camera near the crime scene prior to the shooting. Somehow, Armstrong was able to obtain a fraudulent passport and would use this to flee the country. She would fly from Texas to New York and then fly from the New York International Airport to Costa Rica. She was on the run for 43 days until she was found and arrested on June 29, 2022 at a hostel on Santa Teresa Beach in Costa Rica. Investigators discovered that before she fled Austin, Texas, she sold her Jeep Grand Cherokee to a CarMax dealership. Also, while Armstrong was on the run, she cut her hair and dyed it dark brown and wore a bandage on her nose, claiming she had a surfboarding accident. Collins states that he has a lot of regret and torture knowing that this horrible crime was so close to him. As of June 30, 2022, she is being detained in Costa Rica on an immigration violation until she is deported back to Texas to face murder charges and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Michelle Koski was born in 1973 and was said to love animals and enjoyed playing Super Mario Bros. At the age of 17, she was still in high school and living in Seattle, Lake Washington in the 13,300 block of 30th Avenue Northeast, with her 28-year-old boyfriend. She had plans to attend college the next fall and was working at Taco Bell. On August 18, 1990, she called her mother Violet Simonson and agreed to come back home and stay at her and her stepfather's house to take care of the dog while her mother and stepfather went on a trip out of town. Before going to her parents' house, she visited an apartment earlier in the day in the 6200 block of 14th Avenue, Northwest Seattle, and then was given a ride back to her apartment. At some point, though, she was given a ride to an area in Snohomish County where teens were known to hang out, drink, and ride motorcycles. While there, things would take a terrible turn and she would end up missing. A week later, on August 25, 1990, a woman walking her dog near Echo Lake Road and Highway 522 stumbled upon a female's lifeless body. The finding was in Snohomish, Washington, not far from where Michelle went missing. It was determined that the body belonged to Michelle and she had tragically been sexually assaulted and murdered. Investigators said that whoever committed the crime used pieces of concrete from a nearby pile to finish her off. Her live-in boyfriend was initially a person of interest but would ultimately be ruled out as a suspect. Around the time Michelle's body was found, the Green River Killer had been terrorizing the Seattle area for about a decade, and Seattle investigators considered a serial killer to be a possibility. But sadly, with no concrete evidence pointing at anyone, the case would go cold for the next 3 decades. In 2005, a cold case team reopened her case, and over the next 10 years, they would comb through several possible suspects, but they were all ruled out by DNA comparison. In 2012, The detective on the case stated that what likely happened was the person probably intended to have sex with her, but she didn't want to, and when she tried to flee, he ran her down and strangled her. In 2021, Parban Nanolabs would take the DNA sample, but their process would be extended because they had to deconvolute the DNA sample because it contained the DNA from both the suspect and victim, which makes it a tedious and challenging process. Then, genetic genealogist Deb Stone spent about 9 more months building a family tree and entering her findings into public genealogy websites, including Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. From her home in Oregon, she then found 2 likely suspects, which were 2 brothers, and these names were provided to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office to finish the investigation to determine which one was the likely killer. State and county crime labs compared the crime scene samples to one of the brothers, revealing they were the same person and the DNA was a match. 32 years after her murder, on June 30, 2022, the Sheriff's Office announced they had identified the killer as Robert Anthony Brooks. Authorities say Brooks was 23 at the time and had been released from prison 4 months before the murder and was living with a relative only a few blocks from Michelle. Authorities did not say for what he was previously convicted of, but it was reportedly a juvenile conviction. During his life, he was never on detectives' radar in her case, and it's unclear how and when she crossed paths with Brooks. But this waste of space wouldn't face justice for Michelle's senseless murder because he died of natural causes at the age of 48 in King County, Washington in 2016. Michelle's mother told TV news crews she was grateful there would be no trial and said other families waiting for answers should take this case to heart and wait for the technology as it's getting better every day, and pretty soon none of those bad guys will be able to hide. In August 2019, employees of McKnight Tire in Columbia, Missouri found a small backpack hidden inside of a tire along the tree line at the edge of the store's parking lot. Upon checking it, they made a gruesome discovery. In the backpack was the decomposing remains of a full-term female infant, which was mostly bones. Due to the state of decomposition, the initial autopsy was unable to determine the cause of death or how long the child may have been there. The Columbia Police Department investigated many leads over the next few years, but were unable to determine what happened to the infant and who her parents were. In September of 2020, Columbia Police Department partnered with Othram to use advanced DNA testing to develop new leads that might help identify the infant. A DNA Solves crowdfund was established to cover the cost of testing for the case. Othram was able to build a comprehensive genealogical profile for the infant. Meanwhile, on June 14, 2022, a letter that had been found years earlier in a wallet hidden behind a drawer at a local Super 8 hotel was released to authorities. When it was first discovered in 2019, the hotel employee didn't know the significance of the disturbing letter. It was then placed in a drawer in Lost and Found, where it remained until news of the discovery of the remains hit the news. It appeared to have been written by the mother of the infant and was intended for the police department. By calling the police and alerting them to the letter, the hotel employee really helped the case despite holding on to it for years. A genetic genealogist built a family tree based on the DNA and was able to give law enforcement a possible identification of the baby and her parents. On June 28, 2022, the Columbia Police Department announced that the baby had been identified as Simone J. Daniels. She was 4 to 5 months old when she died at the nearby hotel, and her remains had been inside the tire since 2017. Her parents were arrested the same day as the press conference released the baby's identity. The letter left at the hotel was the key to solving the mystery. 30-year-old Stefan Fountain of St. Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and abandonment of a corpse, and 28-year-old Lavisha Daniels of St. Louis was charged with abandonment of a corpse and first-degree endangering the welfare of a child. The letter allegedly written by Daniels states that she had completed her shift at People Ready, where she had been working on construction projects. She claims that after coming home, Fountain fed the baby before going to bed, and when Daniels woke up, she discovered her daughter in an odd posture with a towel around her neck and blood in her mouth. She claimed they both attempted CPR before she panicked and ran away while Fountain placed the baby in a backpack and left it at McKnight Tire. According to records, state identity cards were also discovered within the wallet that was left at the hotel. As a last note, Simone wasn't their only child. They actually have several other children together. On December 8, 1993, Valerie Brock found the lifeless body of a baby boy in her backyard in a rural area of Hugo, Oklahoma, and called authorities. The medical examiner would determine that the baby was born alive and then murdered. Now a homicide case, Choctaw County Sheriff's Office brought in OSBI agents to help. Agents conducted numerous interviews in the aftermath of the baby's death, including interviewing 25-year-old Myonia Michelle Allen, who was working for Brock and dating Brock's son. Despite the investigation, no suspects in the homicide were identified. The case went cold, but investigators retained samples of the boy's DNA for future use, and he became known as Baby Boy Hugo. Baby Boy Hugo's case captured the hearts of many in rural Oklahoma, with locals raising money to give him a proper burial. He was buried in January 1994 in Babyland, a section of Mount Olivet Cemetery reserved for infants who'd passed away. Fast forward to October 2020 when an OSBI agent teamed up with the Cold Case Unit and criminologist at the OSBI Forensic Science Center. They submitted DNA evidence to Parbon Nanolabs for testing, and by April 2021, they had results. Upon reviewing the results, the OSBI team pursued their leads right back to Myonia Michelle Allen. On June 15, 2022, an OSBI agent met with Allen at the Durant Police Department, and she agreed to submit DNA samples to determine if she was Baby Doe's biological mother. However, they wouldn't need the DNA results because about 20 minutes into the interview, she admitted the baby was hers and admitted to killing him after he was born and burying him in the backyard. At the time of Baby Doe's death, Allen worked at a daycare center and Valerie Brock was her boss, the woman that discovered the baby in her backyard and mother of Allen's boyfriend at the time. She allegedly said that she did not tell anyone about her pregnancy, the delivery, or the baby's alleged murder. The court document states that on December 7, 1993, Allen said she had spent the night at Brock's home along with her boyfriend, his son, and her daughter. During the early morning hours of December 8th, she had a physical altercation which caused her to go into labor unexpectedly at Brock's home and gave birth in a barn on the property. She said she carried the newborn to the house after his birth and laid him on a couch inside. She retrieved a weapon from the house and carried him behind the well house. Later that morning, Brock noticed what she thought was a doll in her backyard, but when she walked outside to retrieve the toy, she realized it was a newborn baby. Investigators had originally learned that Allen had spent the night at Brock's home, so they interviewed her on December 17th, 9 days after the homicide. She told detectives she had never seen a pregnant woman at the house. She initially claimed the baby had been stillborn, but a few days later in a follow-up interview, Allen was shown the baby's autopsy report, proving that this was not true. At that point, Allen allegedly confessed to ending his life with a knife. She said she had intended to have Baby Doe at the hospital and put it up for adoption after his birth. Allen was booked into the Choctaw County Detention Center and is being held without bond, and Baby Doe can now be properly laid to rest and his killer will now be held accountable. Susan Marie Nagersmith was born December 30th, 1969 to parents Marilyn and Kent Nagersmith of Carmel, New York. A cheerleader and competitive skier, she was known for her friendly and outgoing personality and as someone with lots of friends who enjoyed having fun. In 1990, at the age of 20, she had just finished her sophomore year at Westchester Community College, where she was majoring in marketing and made plans to go with 5 close friends to celebrate Memorial Day weekend in the shore town of Wildwood, New Jersey. The girls arrived in Wildwood around 1:30 a.m. on Saturday and rented a room at the Sonata Motel. They had some alcohol and marijuana, and Susan decided to leave the room about 9 p.m. and venture out by herself to see if anything exciting was going on in the area. Since Susan was only 20, she couldn't legally drink at any of the bars that line the streets of Wildwood. Those streets were filled with thousands of young adults who had come to the shore for the holiday weekend, and there were dozens of house parties in the area as well. With many of them spilling over into the streets, it didn't take long for Susan to find one that looked inviting, and she began partying with strangers. At some point during the evening, Susan ended up at a party at the JoJo Apartments on Maple Avenue, about 5 blocks away from the motel where she was staying. By the time she got there, she had already consumed a lot of alcohol and was clearly intoxicated. She was seen throwing up at least once, and witnesses recalled that she was having trouble standing. She was offered a ride back to her motel by at least one person who was concerned about her, but she declined. The next morning, May 27, 1990, her partially clothed body was found near dumpsters behind Schellingers, a restaurant located just 2 blocks from one of the busiest sections of the boardwalk where she was seen hours earlier. There was a bloody handprint on her chest and blood on her t-shirt, which along with her bra was pushed up around her neck. There was also blood found on other parts of her body, and she reportedly had a skull fracture. Her jeans were pulled down and twisted around her left ankle, and her tennis shoes were missing and her feet were clean, showing she hadn't walked without her shoes on. A witness would eventually come forward with information. This witness was a 20-year-old man who was visiting the shore from Philadelphia that had left the apartments around 2 a.m. with her. He later told police that he had attempted to escort her back to her hotel, but she was so drunk that she couldn't recall the name of her hotel or where it was located. The man, who admitted that he had been drinking heavily as well, stated that he eventually gave up on Susan and went back to his own room. It was about 2:30 a.m. when he last saw her leaning against the wall of Schellingers' restaurant on Atlantic Avenue at the time. He said she was so intoxicated that she would have been incapable of consenting to sex. A toxicology report showed her blood alcohol content was 0.285. While this witness was one of the last people to see her alive, he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. Detectives eventually managed to locate and interview a total of 107 people who had seen or spoken to Susan on the night in question. They administered polygraph examinations to 17 people, but all of them were eventually cleared of any involvement in Susan's death. Initially, her death was covered up and classified as accidental due to alcohol intoxication and exposure. It's said that it was ruled accidental because the town wanted to protect terrorism, and it's also said that the medical examiner, Dr. John Napoleon, was incompetent and unqualified for the job. They told the public that she was drunk and she had consensual sex behind the restaurant. And afterwards, she was too drunk to get up, and she froze to death in 57-degree weather. Dr. Napoleon's conclusion was that Susan's cause of death was lethal cardiac arrhythmia and hypothermia due to alcoholic intoxication and exposure. However, he explained away all the bruises on her body by claiming she had likely injured herself by falling down due to her level of intoxication. This lit a fire under her angry parents and local residents as well. Police could no longer conduct a homicide investigation despite the fact that many of them believed Susan had been murdered. A Seattle City resident named Terry Downey joined Susan's parents to attest to accidental ruling. She's also made a name for herself in Cape May County by questioning investigations into the deaths of several other women that occurred in recent years. Susan's parents hired attorneys and private investigators and fought a legal battle. Susan's father, Mr. Negersmith, also sought a second and third opinion from forensic pathologists who both reached the same conclusion. Susan was a homicide victim. The fight for justice had continued for 3 long years when a new prosecutor, Steve Moore, became the new Cape May County District Attorney. After reading the Negersmith's file, Moore reached the same conclusion as Susan's family. He lobbied state law enforcement officials, and an extensive review by the state police led them to the same finding: homicide. After a 3-year battle, her cause of death was changed to homicide after a world-renowned forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, viewed autopsy photos and listed 26 points of trauma on Susan's body. But still, the original medical examiner refused to change her death certificate. It wasn't until 1995 when a new coroner, Dr. Elliot Gross, was appointed coroner and agreed to take another look at Susan's death. Dr. Gross examined Susan's larynx, which had been preserved, and found that it had fractures consistent with manual strangulation. In October 1995, the cause of death on Susan's death certificate was finally changed to homicide. An autopsy determined that she was sexually assaulted before her death, and DNA from the assault was preserved. A profile was later created from the DNA, and in 2018, the Major Crimes Unit started a genetic genealogy analysis of the unknown DNA profile. Using genetic genealogy, genealogists and investigators were able to narrow it down to 62-year-old Jerry Rosado. Rosado then provided a buccal swab on May 26, 2021, exactly 31 years after the attack, to officially verify the match. He was later arrested 32 years after the murder, but has only been charged with second-degree crime of sexual assault. No murder charges have been filed in the case, but authorities say further charges could be made should additional information become available. He now faces 5 to 10 years if convicted of the sexual assault. 22-year-old Christine McWhorter and her aunt 31-year-old Beatrice Daniels were originally from the Philadelphia area of Pennsylvania and moved to Mount Union, Pennsylvania to get away from the city violence. The women lived in the Chestnut Terrace housing complex with Christine's 4-month-old daughter and 4-year-old son in Mount Union. Neighbors would report that on January 3, 2009, they heard yelling and commotion in the early morning hours. Later that same morning, Christine's 4-year-old son was able to finally get a neighbor's attention. That's when it was discovered that both women were found lying in their bed, shot to death. It's unknown how long the children were left alone with the bodies, but it's believed the murders occurred sometime between 9 p.m. on January 2nd and noon on January 3rd, which is when the 4-year-old got the attention of a neighbor. Droplets of blood were taken into evidence from the scene, and the initial DNA report concluded that the blood collected from the stairs and interior doors of the apartment were all deposited by an unidentified male. 7 years later, on March 14, 2016, Trooper David Clemens submitted DNA samples to DNA Solutions, which in turn prepared and forwarded the samples to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon performed phenotyping on a blood sample which narrowed the suspect down to a medium to light-skinned African-American male with green or hazel eyes and little to no freckles. On July 12, 2018, Parabon conducted a genetic genealogy analysis of the DNA recovered from the murder scene. 3 months later, they provided a report on the genetic genealogy of the DNA and identified Mariko Tyrone Johnson as a potential match. Johnson was interviewed over a year later at his home in Newport News, Virginia. He told investigators that he knew Christine through his then-girlfriend, Cynthia Swan, whom he dated from 2001 until 2012. The women were close friends, but Johnson denied having ever entered Christine's apartment. He provided his DNA to detectives, which was sent off to the state police lab in December 2019. The lab reported Johnson's DNA matched the blood evidence found on the stairs and interior doors of the crime scene. Investigators then compared Johnson's time card to the estimated time of the double murder. The complaint says that on January 22, 2020, state police received time cards from Johnson's then-employer, the New York Department of Corrections, which confirmed he was off of work on January 2, 2009, and started his January 3rd shift at 7 a.m. Police estimate the time it takes to travel the 294 miles between Mount Union and Johnson's thin workplace is 4 hours and 43 minutes. Police checked to see if Johnson had access to a .25 caliber firearm, the type used to kill Christine and Beatrice. His half-brother told troopers that he thought his late father owned a .25 caliber handgun and that Johnson inherited their father's belongings when he passed away in 1998. Johnson was then arrested on May 24, 2022 and charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide 13 years after the double murder. Investigators interviewed Johnson's ex-girlfriend, Cynthia, and learned that she was originally supposed to travel with Christine from Philadelphia to Mount Union on January 1, 2009 and stay for the weekend, but decided at the last minute to remain in Philadelphia with a man, Benjamin June. Cynthia told the troopers it was around this time that Johnson found out that Cynthia was having an affair with June. Police say the last incoming text on Christine's cell phone was from Cynthia, asking Christine to call her, and it was important, but she never responded to the text. Johnson remains behind bars with an upcoming trial, but has spent the last 13 years enjoying his freedom. Kara Nancy Nichols was born on May 20, 1993 to parents Julia and Paul Nichols. She grew up in Colorado Springs, Colorado with an older brother and a younger sister. During her sophomore year of high school, Kara fell into depression when her family dog died. Her parents tried to get her to go to counseling, but Kara refused and didn't take her prescribed medication. Instead, Kara started using drugs and became rebellious and manic and was most likely struggling with an untreated mental illness. She attended Rampart High School in Colorado Springs and later graduated from local alternative high school Life Skills of Colorado Springs, where she could work at her own pace. After graduation, Kara began waitressing and modeling part-time, mostly lingerie shoes. She also created a profile on Model Mayhem, an online modeling website that links models with photographers. In the summer of 2012, Kara quit her job and moved with her family to Chicago, Illinois. Her drug abuse worsened and her family enrolled her in a drug treatment program, but she was discharged early when she didn't follow the rules. In August of 2012, Kara moved back to Colorado Springs on her own. She lived in a home with 3 male roommates in the 6700 block of Mission Road in the Cimarron Hills area of Colorado Springs. A couple months later, on October 9, 2012, she told her roommate that she would be traveling from Colorado Springs to Denver for a photo shoot job. When she left, she was picked up by someone in a dark sedan. Her brother Terrence last spoke to her at almost midnight that night, and she said she was on her way to Denver for a modeling assignment. 2 days later, Kara's parents reported her missing when she didn't return. On November 30, 2012, a profile featuring photos of Kara appeared on My Red Book, which is an online Las Vegas escort website. When police called the number, her family said the voice was not hers. Authorities eventually concluded that the photos were taken from another source and that Kara was not in Las Vegas. And escort websites often use random pictures lifted from the internet to advertise online. Months later, police learned she had actually been working as an escort and had placed an ad wearing lingerie on a classified ad website at 7:28 p.m. the night she disappeared. Kara's cell phone records revealed she made 8 calls on October 9, 2012 between 9:58 p.m. and 11:08 p.m. and that she last used her phone at 11:59 p.m. On May 8, 2013, the detective finally received a return call from a man who identified himself as Joel Hollendorfer. When asked if the phone belonged to Hollendorfer, he said yes. The detective said he was investigating a missing person case and his number was on the list of records from the night she disappeared. Hollendorfer said he was seeking escort services that night and answered Kara's ad, saying they spoke several times that night, but he was looking to go to her, but she only went to locations. Hollendorfer went on to say that they never met that night. Investigations volunteer Mark Oldfield was able to track Kara's phone movements the night of October 9th to its last known usage in the early hours of October 10th, 2012. Mark was able to determine that Kara left her house at approximately 11:16 p.m. and traveled the route that led directly toward Burgess Road, where Hollendorfer's family owned a farm. Further details revealed 6 calls and texts were sent and received from 11:34 p.m. to 11:41 p.m. coming off Woodsman Tower. Based on Kara's phone activity, her phone was at the intersection of Woodman and Black Forest Road at 11:33 p.m. Based on the last known activity from Kira's phone, it led them to 9665 Burgess Road. Detective Gigliotta obtained a search warrant for the address on October 2, 2014, a year after she went missing. Multiple agencies participated in the search, including cadaver dogs. Hollendorfer's mother, Betty, walked the property with members from the search team and pointed out numerous locations where animals may be buried since purchasing the property in 1985. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property and ground-penetrating radar was used to determine spots that had been disturbed. But instead of excavating the spots, they did what Betty suggested. They searched the property across the street at 11,660 Greenacres Lane, which her son also had access to. Cadaver dogs narrowed in on a shallow grave which was excavated, and it was apparent that roots were dug up at the site and a hole had been dug to about the size of a human body, but no human remains were found. For reasons that are not explained in the affidavit, none of the other areas the dogs hid on were excavated, leading to the question, why bring cadaver dogs to a property and not dig when they hid on certain areas? Turns out, Betty was protecting her son, and if they would have excavated the areas across the street that the dogs hid on, they would have found what they were looking for. During an interview that same month, Hollendorfer admitted to looking up Kara online, wanting to meet her and communicating with her. He said Kara never met him at the location that she was supposed to, and he never ended up meeting her. He added that he had been heavily involved with escorts and drugs, which he says is why his marriage ended. During the initial investigation, Detective Gigliotta attempted to reach Hollendorfer's wife, Christina, but she wouldn't cooperate with the initial investigation and never made a statement. However, on February 1, 2022, 10 years after Kara's disappearance, FBI special agents interviewed Christina. Turns out, she had been keeping a huge secret for 8 years, until investigators tracked her down to Virginia and knocked on her door. Now known as Christina Palmer, she stated that after Hollendorfer's father died in November 2014, he admitted to her that he accidentally killed an escort he hired and buried her body on top of an old horse grave on his parents during the interview. Christina stated that Hollendorfer said that he accidentally strangled Kara to death and then buried her on an old horse grave with plastic bags and lime. She also told detectives that Hollendorfer said he told his parents what he did and that he believed it had driven his father to his grave. Based on the information she provided, on February 7, 2022, a search warrant was obtained and a team of El Paso County Sheriff's Office detectives and specialists, alongside the FBI Evidence Response Team, were deployed to the 9600 block of Burgess Road. Police zeroed in on a spot where his mother said her favorite horse Milo was buried. 3 feet down, they found a garbage bag, a human hand, and more remains. Hollendorfer was then arrested days later on charges of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence, ending a 10-year mystery that could have ended 9 years earlier. During a court appearance on February 17, 2022, Hollendorfer's charge was upgraded from second to first-degree murder, and his bond was revoked based on the autopsy results. Kara's family has long maintained that the El Paso County Sheriff's Department botched the initial investigation and the sheriff, Terry McKetta, was run out of office amid allegations of misconduct in 2014. Some describe McKetta's term in Colorado Springs as similar to living in the Wild West. Many describe former Sheriff McKetta as very corrupt. He allegedly led an incredibly corrupt department and was involved with multiple women in the department, giving them lavish raises and spending department funds on romantic vacations with them. He would also allegedly punish or fire the women who wouldn't sleep with him. He also allegedly had a hit list of people he intended to kill. At the same time, one officer was running an extensive Ponzi scheme in the department. David Hawkins had collected around $300,000 in cash from fellow deputies and even their families, but never invested it and was eventually convicted and sent to prison. The allegations against McKetta were already years old at that point, but he couldn't be forced to resign because of some technicality. McKetta also mismanaged the investigation into the devastating Black Forest fire. In the summer of 2021, less than a year before Kara's body was discovered, several local area residents became concerned about the condition of 2 horses on the Hollendorfer's property, Meadowview Farm. The El Paso County Sheriff's Office investigated and had a veterinarian and a horse rescue come to the site. Unfortunately, both horses had to be euthanized because they were so starved they could not be saved. It's unclear what, if any, charges were filed against the Hollendorfers. I'm sure they were likely more concerned about law enforcement being so close to Kara's grave at the time. Her parents were in disbelief 2 years after their daughter went missing over a recording released by the El Paso County Sheriff's Office that suggests the initial investigator brushed off the case. In the 50-minute recording, Patrol Deputy Cliff Porter is confronted by his superiors about statements he made in Kara's case. Porter was taken off the case after a couple of months, but he came under fire after statements he made to his replacement were reported to his superiors. He repeated those statements in a meeting as well. This is what he said. I said, maybe somebody would finally just say, look, this is a cold case. This girl is probably dead. We're going to work the leads, but we're going to shelve this thing. We won't overreact every time Mr. Nichols comes in. Kira's mother stated that in the first few weeks, they were wondering why Officer Porter wouldn't respond to their calls. And when he did, he seemed very cynical, very negative about the possibility of finding their daughter alive. She stated, "You just wonder what else has gone on. You wonder how many other victims have been treated like this. It just re-victimized a family who's already suffering." 34-year-old Rita Gutierrez Garcia was born April 7, 1983, and was described as an attentive and compassionate mother of her 3 boys. On March 17, 2018, she went out with friends to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. After spending time at the Speakeasy and Breakers Grill on Main Street in Longmont, Colorado, she and friends went through the alleyway to the parking lot behind Three's Bar to leave. Rita was on the phone with someone at 2:30 a.m. when she told her friends she was getting a ride with someone else, and so they left. Sadly, This is the last time they would see her alive. Later, her mom arrived at Rita's home on Sunday to take her 18, 13, and 9-year-old grandsons to church. That's when the grandmother learned her daughter was missing, and after an exhaustive search for her, they reported her missing the following day. Early on in the investigation, Juan Figueroa was identified as a possible suspect in her disappearance. Several witnesses also reported that he had interacted with Rita inside the bar about 1:30 a.m. and was seen outside of the bar near her about an hour later. A security camera captured Figueroa's truck traveling through that exact same area at 3:03 a.m. Cell phone data from Rita's phone placed her phone near the 600 block between Main Street and Kaufman Street between 2:40 a.m. to 03:03 a.m. on the morning she was last seen. 4 minutes later, 2 911 call hang-ups were made from Rita's phone. Her phone dropped off the network at 3:10 a.m. and was in the area of 3rd Avenue and Vivian Street in Longmont at that time. Rita was missing, and evidence pointed to one person responsible for her disappearance. That was Figueroa. Figueroa left Colorado 2 days after Rita went missing after police attempted to contact him at his mother's home in regards to her disappearance. He was briefly in Texas, but later crossed the border into Mexico. While in Mexico, he asked several people for money and said he was in trouble and that he planned to sell his truck. He tried to re-enter the U.S. and was arrested on March 27, 2018 on a warrant for a separate sexual assault and attempted murder of a woman a year earlier, for which he was later convicted and sentenced to 93 years to life. While behind bars, he told a cellmate that he strangled the missing woman and disposed of her body before returning to his sister's house. He also told that cellmate, according to the indictment, that she had called him a weirdo, which caused him to punch her, knocking her unconscious. After that, he strangled her to death. Prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury in April 2021 as a no-body homicide, as DNA evidence and cell phone data linked him to her presumed murder. 2 months later, the grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder and kidnapping in Rita's case. In court, he admitted to knocking her unconscious, dragging her to his vehicle, and strangling her. He said he believed he was insane that night and snapped when she called him a weirdo. As part of a plea deal, Figueroa led investigators to the location of Rita's body. She was recovered in an area of northern Colorado's Weld County on April 28, 2022. Figueroa pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. He was immediately sentenced to 48 years in prison. The sentences will be served concurrently along with the 93-year sentence he's already serving for the unrelated case of kidnapping and attempted murder of another victim. Clifford Bernhard served his country as an Army sergeant in the Vietnam War and was ultimately awarded a Purple Heart. After serving in the Army, he began working as a construction worker. On June 7, 1969, he would marry his high school sweetheart, Linda Reich. The couple was very much in love and very well liked by all that knew them. On November 6, 1973, the 24-year-olds were still settling into their new ranch-style home at 1116 Dorothy Lane near the Yellowstone River in Billings, Montana. They had planned to go have dinner at Linda's parents' house around the corner, but they decided to cancel. Linda called her mother June Reich and told her they planned on staying in for the night instead. The two enjoyed a hamburger casserole that Linda had whipped up for them. The next morning, when Linda didn't show up for work, her mother went to check on the couple and came upon a horrifying scene. She found the couple tragically and brutally murdered. Cliff was found lying face down in the master bedroom with a severe wound to his head. Cliff and Linda had both been strangled to death, and Linda had been sexually assaulted and left naked on the floor of another bedroom. There were also signs that both were bound at the wrist and ankles at some point. Strangely, and possibly from the shock of it all, while waiting for law enforcement to arrive, Linda's mother cleaned up the dishes which disturbed the crime scene. She stated that it appeared to her that before doing the dishes that the table may have been set for 3 people. The killer had opened up windows in both bedrooms the bodies were found in and turned the furnace down all the way. The lowest temperature that night was 6 degrees, making it cold enough for a bowl of ice cubes found next to Linda's body to remain frozen. It's unknown what the bowl of ice next to her body was for, but possibly used during the sexual assault. Missing from the house was all of Linda's panties, some of her shoes, and her green suitcase. With no signs of forced entry, investigators speculated that they knew their killer and had willingly let them in. Also, the murder may have been premeditated as he brought his own leather bindings. The crime devastated the Bernhard and Reich families and left a void in the lives of all who knew Linda and Clifford. Over many years, about 80 DNA samples were collected from persons of interest, but none were a match. In 2004, there was a huge break in the case when DNA was discovered on Linda's purple pants. It was entered into Cody's, but there was no matches. Then in 2012, a cold case unit became obsessed with finding the killer in the following year. An anonymous donor offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to a conviction. In 2015, the county hired Parabon to analyze the DNA and created a composite predicting the suspect's ethnicity, hair, and eye color and complexion. A few years later, in 2018, when forensic genetic genealogy was fully blossoming, genealogists were working tirelessly to pinpoint who the DNA belonged to. Finally, on January 3, 2019, Parabon determined the suspect was one of two brothers. Unfortunately, one of those brothers had died, and so investigators obtained DNA from the one living and were able to rule him out, which means the DNA could only belong to one individual. 45 years after Linda and Cliff's deaths, authorities announced the suspect, Cecil Stan Caldwell, a former co-worker of Linda's at a grocery store warehouse. Linda worked in billing and secretarial work while Caldwell worked in the warehouse and meat department. He was also a father of 2 adopted children and 2 stepchildren and had no criminal history. Unfortunately, in 2003, he died in Billings at the age of 59 and never faced justice. Caldwell had no arrest record, and authorities likely will never know the true motive for the slayings. Former Deputy Dean Mellum, who worked on the case in 1973, said he hopes the news will at least give some comfort to the couple's families. In the early morning hours of October 28, 1994, a Seattle Times newspaper delivery person called 911 when he saw a woman's body at the end of 55th Street, a remote dead-end street in Renton, Washington. When the officers arrived, they found a woman and young boy lying in the middle of the road next to a car, both shot to death. The bodies belonged to 23-year-old Stacy and Falcon Dewey and her 3-year-old son, Jacob Dewey. Investigators recovered 5 38mm cartridge casings from the scene, 3 near the bodies and 2 inside of the 1984 Buick Century, which belonged to Stacy. Police say there was a struggle at the scene based on evidence collected, and Stacy had been sexually assaulted. Some of the contents of Stacy's purse were strewn about the vehicle, including her wallet. Several items had also been thrown out of the passenger side door onto the street, including buttons from Stacy's shirt, her shoes, the car's floor mat, and packaging tape which was used during the crime. Putting together a timeline, police determined that Stacy had spent the evening celebrating her birthday with friends while Jacob was being cared for by his regular babysitter. She then picked up Jacob from the babysitter's apartment at the Kenton Ridge apartment complex between 1:20 a.m. and 2 a.m., less than 5 miles from where they were killed. Stacy had previously lived at the apartment complex in Kent, Washington, but had moved out months earlier. She was seen getting into the car with Jacob, and her boyfriend was expecting them home soon in Kent. 2 people who lived nearby where they were found told police that they heard what sounded like gunshots just after 2 a.m. Despite an extensive investigation, detectives were unable to come up with a suspect or person of interest in the case for nearly a decade. But by 2001, there were advances in DNA and genetic testing. So several pieces of evidence collected from the crime scene were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The evidence included fingernail clippings and swabs of semen obtained from Stacy's autopsy. In 2002, this DNA evidence was matched to Jerome Frank Jones. Shockingly, Stacy and Jacob's murder case then slipped through the cracks and remained officially unsolved for the next 16 years. When DNA was matched to Jones in 2002, the cold case detective presented the evidence to prosecutors for charges. Once it was realized that Jones was already behind bars and would be there for a long period of time, they decided to hold off. Then, 16 years later, the case became the subject of a Seattle Times series, titled In the Dark, which told of how the case, although seemingly solved, was neglected for years with Jones not being charged. Stacy's mother didn't even officially learn about the DNA tying Jones to her daughter's and grandson's murders until March 2019, 25 years after their murders. Even then, she only heard about it from a Seattle Times reporter, not law enforcement. Jones was already serving a 56-year sentence for murdering 30-year-old businessman Gregory Hebden in Irvine, California, just 5 months after the murders of Stacy and Jacob. He has an extensive criminal record for felony assaults, robbery, drug possession, and the murder in California. Once known as Rome Dog, he grew up near Compton, California, and was part of the Crips gang in the 80s and 90s. His first conviction was for crack possession in 1993 in Washington. While in custody for the murder of Mr. Hebden, he brutally assaulted a corrections officer and was convicted of 2 felony assaults and felony weapon possession. He is currently eligible for parole in 2030, but if he's convicted of Stacy and Jacob's murders, he will most likely receive life in prison. Investigators flew to California to interview Jones in prison. He confirmed he lived near Renton, Washington from 1994 to 1995, but did not ever meeting or knowing Stacy. Investigators said they then confirmed that Jones had lived at the Kenton Ridge apartment complex at the same time as Stacy and Jacob, and that he was in the area on the night of their murders. In December of 2021, new investigators learned that Jones's DNA matched samples found on the jacket that little Jacob was wearing when he was killed. 27 years after their lives were taken by yet another waste of space, he was finally charged with 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder in February 2022. Jones is scheduled to appear for arraignment on February 28th at the Maling Regional Justice Center in Kent, Washington. In 1993, 20-year-old Sophie Sergi was employed as a teacher's assistant and lived in the small village of Pickus Point, Alaska. In April of 1993, she flew to Bethel and then to Anchorage to have her braces adjusted at the orthodontist and spent the night with a family friend. She then flew to Fairbanks and went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She was a previous student there from 1990 to 1992, but had taken time off to move home and save money for orthodontic work she needed done. While there, she was staying with Shirley Masully for a couple of days, who was living in a dorm at the Bartlett Hall at the university. Sophie stepped out a little after midnight to smoke a cigarette, and as she was leaving the room, Shirley told her that she could go smoke near the exhaust fence and the tub room of the women's bathroom because it was too cold outside. While Sophie was gone for a smoke, Shirley and her boyfriend Noah Taylor left to go spend the rest of the night in Noah's dorm. At some point in the evening, her friend took a photo of Sophie. This would unknowingly be her final picture before her life was sadly taken. It was the end of the term, and people were coming and going from campus, and anyone could have access to the women's floor using the elevator or the stairs. The next morning, her friend returned about 9 a.m. and noticed the dorm room unlocked and Sophie gone. She was irritated that Sophie had left the door unlocked and assumed she was out taking a long shower. Strangely, the room appeared to be the same as she had left it, and the note she had left Sophie letting her know she would be staying the rest of the night with Noah was still on the door. Shirley didn't think much of it at the time, but later realized this all indicated that Sophie never returned. Later in the day, she contacted the orthodontist and was told that Sophie had never made her appointment. That afternoon on April 26th, a janitor found her body in the common area dormitory bathtub. She had been murdered and sexually assaulted. With no leads, the case would go cold for 16 long years. Investigators were bumfuzzled as to how no one had heard a gunshot that night. The tub room was a small, separate room next to the shower stalls in the east bathroom and had a shower stall-type swinging door at the entrance of the room. A female resident of Bartlett Hall indicated she was in the shower on the second floor at approximately 1:30 a.m. on April 26th. The shower stall shared a wall with the tub room where Sophie's body would later be discovered. The girl reported hearing noises coming from that room, including thumping and muffled voices, but apparently didn't check it out or report it. After she was found, the dormitory was never locked down to search for evidence outside the bathroom where she was murdered. They were, however, able to collect DNA from the crime scene. In 2019, the suspect's DNA was matched to a likely suspect through genetic genealogy. 44-year-old nurse Stephen Downs was arrested in Auburn, Maine for the murder of Sophie. He was only 18 years old at the time he committed the murder. Downs was not identified as a suspect until authorities discovered a DNA match with his aunt who had uploaded a sample to a commercial online genealogy database. Investigators then obtained a sample of Downs when they executed a search warrant at his home in Auburn, Maine on February 14, 2019. The sample matched the DNA taken from the crime scene. Downs was a freshman at the university in 1993 and lived in the same dorm where Sophie was killed, but lived on one of the male floors. Downs did not testify, but jurors heard a recording of his conversation with investigators in which he denied knowing Sophie and denied keeping a gun in his dorm room. In the recordings, he told police he was with his then-girlfriend the night Sophie died. However, she testified during the trial that he had actually left the room several times that evening. An expert testified that Sophie died from a .22 caliber bullet and from a knife wound. Downs' friend and then roommate testified that he owned guns and a large hunting knife, including a .22 caliber pistol. His former roommate, Nicholas Dozier, at the time was a security officer on campus who was later fired for owning a firearm which was not allowed in the dorms. Dozier was on duty the night of Sophie's murder, and he subsequently assisted police on the 26th in making sure the crime scene was not disturbed. After attending college at UAF, from 1992 to 1996, Downs lived in Tucson, Arizona from 1998 to 2003 before he ultimately returned to Maine. Downs was fired from a nursing job for making female co-workers uncomfortable with inappropriate behavior and medication handling errors. Downs is the first man in Alaska to stand trial for a charge that resulted from genetic genealogy. No motive was given for the killing, and it is unclear if he and Sophie knew each other prior to her death. He was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault on February 9, 2022. Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez, who went by Jessie, was born December 3, 1981 to Deborah and David Gutierrez. In 1983, when Jessie was 2 years old, her parents would divorce. At the age of 4, Jessie lived with her mother and 8-year-old brother and shared a bedroom with her 2 sisters in their mobile home in the Edmond community in Lexington, South Carolina. Jessie's mother, Deborah, awoke the morning of June 6, 1986 to find her daughter missing from the bed, where she normally slept with her 2 sisters, ages 6 and 10. She asked her other children if they knew where Jessie was, but they did not. The front door was unlocked, which had previously been bolted the night before. She checked the yard and then called family to help her search for Jessie in the surrounding woods around the home. One thing that always stood out was something Jessie's 6-year-old sister, Rebecca, had said to their mother. The man with the magic hat and the beard had taken Jessie. Rebecca, now an adult, remember seeing a man lift Jessie out of the bed and carry her away, and the man was able to do this without waking Jessie. Rebecca was lying right next to Jessie, but had been too frightened to tell anyone until the next morning when Jessie was discovered missing. Investigators later determined that someone had entered the family's mobile home sometime between midnight and 7:30 a.m. The abductor had removed the window screen and curtains from a living room window and climbed inside. The kidnapper then left with her through the front door. Authorities searched by land and by air for little Jessie, but never found her. Deborah initially blamed her ex-boyfriend because she had broken up with him a few days before, but he said he had no idea where Jessie was. The man was repeatedly questioned by police but never charged. Authorities tried to locate Jessie's father, and he was last known to be living in Mexico City. However, he was ruled out as a suspect in the case as he had been living in California at the time of her abduction. A family acquaintance, Thomas McDowell of West Columbia, was suspected because a long fingerprint of his was found on Jessie's bedroom window. Deborah told detectives she cleaned the windows of the home every night, and the only fingerprint found belonged to McDowell. The print was matched to McDowell 10 weeks after the kidnapping because his fingerprints were put on file when he was convicted of breaking into a woman's home and sexually assaulting her in North Carolina. In 1987, McDowell would be sentenced to 10 years in prison on a rape charge. Deborah also found fibers in an abandoned car that were linked to her daughter, a car which had been connected to McDowell. In 1987, McDowell allegedly told a cellmate that he had kidnapped a girl in Lexington County and buried her body in a landfill in that same county. He mentioned that he was wearing a tall cowboy hat at the time of the kidnapping, which might explain the magic hat that Rebecca had mentioned. His cellmate told authorities about his statements, and when police confronted McDowell, he offered to confess if he got immunity from prosecution for the crime. Immunity was denied, and McDowell did not speak any further on the subject. Deputies searched the landfill, but Jesse's body was never found. Finally, 35 years later, on January 6, 2022, 61-year-old Thomas Eric McDowell was arrested from his home on 842 North White Street in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and charged with Jesse's murder. His older brother Charles McDowell was sent to California's death row in 1984 for murder as well. Lexington County authorities did not give details of any new evidence against McDowell that may have led to his arrest. For 35 years, Jesse's mother has fought tooth and nail to find justice for her daughter. And while she faced many hurdles, she never gave up the fight for her daughter. Sadly, her body has not been found, but the evil, heartless bastard Thomas McDowell will finally spend the rest of his life behind bars. 47-year-old Darrell Dwayne Bowden of Linden, North Carolina will spend the next 22 years behind bars for committing a series of 6 sexual assaults between 2006 and 2008 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Before DNA connected him to the crimes, he was dubbed the Ramsey Street Rapist because all of the crimes occurred on or near Ramsey Street in Fayetteville. During the investigation, law enforcement reached out to Peerbond Nanolabs, who created composite snapshots of what the suspect may look like today. The snapshots were created using DNA left behind at 3 of the crime scenes and by using descriptions given by victims of his. A judge ordered police to extract his DNA, and it was a match. Throughout 2006, a woman reported being assaulted at the Village at Carver Falls at Ramsey Street in Carver Falls Road. Then a 23-year-old woman was assaulted after a man grabbed her from behind while she was jogging and training for a marathon in the area of Ramsey Street and Oates Drive. After assaulting her in the woods, he had the audacity to ask for her name and what she would be doing later. Throughout 2007, a 44-year-old woman living in Kings Grant condominiums on Bubble Creek Court reported that she was assaulted by a man who broke into her residence. A 15-year-old living in the Village of Carver's Falls was assaulted in her home by an intruder that entered the window while she was home alone. Her bedsheets had cartoon characters on it, but even that didn't deter him. She later dropped out of high school, became involved in an abusive relationship, and began to self-harm because she hated her body for not fighting hard enough against her attacker. By her early 20s, she no longer wanted to live. But now at the age of 30, she's happily married and on the dean's list at college. A 21-year-old student at Methodist University, living in the Heather Ridge Apartments on Ramsey Street between Kenlaw and Carver's Fall Roads, reported being assaulted by a man who broke into her apartment. Her 2 friends were asleep in another room, and he told her if she wasn't quiet, they would get it too. He asked her too what she'd be doing later. Because there were roommates, Bowden led her out of the sliding glass doors and into a field where he sexually assaulted her. He assaulted her again on her patio before telling her to go back inside and lay on the couch. He warned her he would know if she didn't because he could see her through the sliding glass doors. Before leaving, he took her keys, cell phone, and purse. Then in January 2008, a 29-year-old woman said she was sexually assaulted by a man who broke into her home in the Kings Grant condominiums while her husband was on a military deployment. There was no DNA, but the suspect had the same MO. Bowden is also accused of stealing property from some of the women. He attended Pine Forest High School and grew up in the Linden area. In 1993, at the age of 19, Bowden was sentenced to 8 years in prison for breaking into vehicles and larceny. He was given a suspended sentence but violated his probation and was incarcerated. He only spent 6 months in prison where he earned his GED and a swastika tattoo. Since 1992, Bowden has been charged with numerous offenses, but nearly all of them were dismissed. In 2009, he was charged with a peeping Tom offense before the General Assembly enacted a law requiring DNA samples to be taken from those arrested on certain charges. In 2014, he was in court for a felony but not convicted, so no DNA was collected. Records show more than 70 criminal filings against him since his 1998 release from prison. At the time of his arrest, Bowden was living at the 500 block of Palestine Road in Linden, was a father of 6 and working in the heating and air conditioning business. He took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to 24 charges of rape, 6 accounts of first-degree kidnapping, 5 counts of first-degree burglary, 2 counts of larceny, 2 counts of possession of stolen goods, first-degree statutory rape, and indecent liberties with a child. In exchange for the plea, redundant charges were dismissed. His friends and parents stated that they were shocked and don't believe he is capable of committing these crimes. He took a plea deal on February 11, 2022 and will spend at least 22 years in prison and a maximum of 29, with credit for time served since his arrest in August 2018. Judge Ammons denied Bowden's request that he be considered for work release and said that he would even request that Bowden not be a candidate for early release and ordered the women's testimony be transcribed to share it with any parole board. 5 of the 6 women were present on the first row in court to see this horrible person's sentence. Police are asking anyone who believes they may have been a victim or who knows someone they believe to have been a victim of Bowden's to come forward and talk with detectives. Crystal Faye Todd was born on January 4, 1974 in Conway, South Carolina to parents Junior and Bonnie Todd. At the age of 17, she was a senior at a Conway, South Carolina high school, and as an early graduation gift, her mother Bonnie Faye Todd had given her a brand new 1991 Toyota Celica. On November 17, 1991, Crystal stopped in for her grandmother's birthday celebration and left about 7 p.m. kissing her mother goodbye and saying she was headed to the mall to meet her friends. Around 9 p.m. Crystal and a friend decided to go to a party in the Punch Bowl community where they stayed until 11 p.m. After dropping her friend off at home, Crystal rushed back to the mall to say goodbye to friends before her midnight curfew. But she never arrived home that night, and when midnight came and went, her mother became very concerned. At 3 a.m., Bonnie phoned police and a dispatcher took her description along with the description of her car. He tried to reassure her it wasn't unusual for teens to show up late and that Bonnie should just let him know when her daughter got home. At 8 a.m., Bonnie was panicking and called 911. Next, she contacted her daughter's longtime close friend, Ken Register, who said that he hadn't seen Crystal all night and that he would check the local hospitals. 2 of Crystal's friends had found her car parked at the Conway Middle School. An officer was dispatched to the location and found the car locked with Crystal's purse still inside. The officer tried to reassure her that Crystal was likely still out with friends and having too much fun to call or come home. But Bonnie knew that wasn't like Crystal, and she said she knew her daughter wasn't coming home. The next day, on November 18, 1991, 2 men were driving just outside of Conway in the Maple community when one of them noticed something odd lying in the ditch along the road. Getting out for a closer inspection, the men realized it was a female body. The scene was gruesome, and she was found to have been sexually assaulted. Her mother, a widow, was inconsolable. She told police that she was certain that Crystal's killer was someone she knew. Investigators believed the same thing, especially when they learned that she would have never gotten into a vehicle with someone she didn't know. Criminal profilers predicted that the killer would be an angry young white male who was confident the law wouldn't catch him, and he was probably a friend of the victim. Police asked 51 of Crystal's male friends and acquaintances if they would give DNA samples, and they all agreed. Crystal's friends, including longtime friend Ken Register, were there for Bonnie through the entire ordeal. Ken and Crystal had grown up together and remained close friends, and even Bonnie had always been fond of him. He was a shoulder for Bonnie to cry on and someone to rant to. However, before she was murdered, the friendship between Crystal and Ken had taken a turn for the worse. Crystal had confided in Bonnie that Ken had propositioned her for sex, despite the fact that he had a girlfriend and she had been appalled by this. The 2 had dated briefly in their early teens, but then decided to return to being close friends again. There had also been serious warning signs about Ken in the previous years. When he was 15, he made an obscene phone call to a grown woman and described in sickening detail how he wanted to mutilate and kill her. When it was his turn to be interviewed by police, he hesitantly but willingly provided his DNA, but the lab was backlogged, and it would be a couple months before they got to all the DNA samples collected from the citizens. Then, on February 15, 1992, the lab notified the police that they had a DNA match. Ken Register, Register eventually broke down and confessed to the crime. He told investigators a story that is very likely untrue. He told them on the night Crystal died, they had unprotected consensual sex. Ken said when he didn't use protection, Crystal became furious and threatened to cry rape if she became pregnant. Said he became outraged at Crystal's screaming and insults, and before he realized what he was doing, he was stabbing her. Ken told investigators when he came to his senses and realized what he'd done, he panicked. He pulled Crystal from his car, tossed her into the ditch, threw away the knife and hurried home. Crystal's car keys and other evidence was found located at the Register home. Bonnie was shocked that she had been duped by Ken, who even served as a pallbearer at her daughter's funeral. After Register's arrest, it was discovered he had been arrested in September 1991 for exposing himself to a couple of teenage girls after asking them for directions. The charges were still pending when he was arrested for Crystal's murder. In September 1992, Register was tried on the indecent exposure charges and quickly found guilty. Then in early 1993, jurors found him guilty for Crystal's death, his sexual misconduct, kidnapping, and torture. Ken Register was sentenced to life in prison and remains incarcerated at the Broad River Prison in Columbia, South Carolina. There are reportedly many friends and family members of Crystal's who continue to write to and attend parole hearings. Anytime he is eligible. Despite being sentenced to 2 life sentences, he was eligible for parole in February 2022, but he waived his right to face the parole board. Nearly 2,700 people signed a petition asking that his parole not be granted. He will be eligible to face the parole board again in 2024. Her mother Bonnie passed away in 2014 and is buried next to her daughter in Conway. Yanira Cedias was born on March 3, 1992, and by the age of 30, she was a mother of 3 young children and described as vibrant and lively with a big smile. On March 4, 2022, Yanira was celebrating her 30th birthday at a local casino. After the celebration, her ex-boyfriend, Juan Gastelum, picked her up and took her back to his apartment. This was the last time she was ever seen alive. After going missing, Moses Lake police called Yanira's phone to see if someone would answer. A man believed to be her ex, Gastelum, answered the phone. This information led police to question Gastelum. Allegedly, after they arrived at his apartment, Gastelum murdered Yanira and then took photos of himself sexually assaulting her. He then left the apartment with her body. Her family, with help of volunteers and community members, started searching several locations for Yanira's remains. Over 2 months later, on May 12th, detectives received data from Gastelum's cell phone leading them to where he went after leaving the apartment that night, which was a remote area off Highway 12 just outside Wauhula Junction, Washington. When authorities arrived at the location, they found her body in a sleeping bag covered with tree limbs and leaves. At this time, the medical examiner has not released the details on how Yanira died. However, Moses Lake police say that they found a large hunting knife that Gastelum threw away at a gas station and cadaver dogs detected human blood on it. He was arrested days later in Oregon, but fought extradition for 2 months before finally being extradited back to Washington state. He was charged with second-degree murder and second-degree rape following disturbing photos found on his cell phone. Documents also say Gastelum admitted to being physically abusive to Yanira, as 2 physical domestic calls were referenced from October 2021 and January 2022. On October 4, 2021, Yanira even requested a police report to get a restraining order against Gastelum. Gastelum had pleaded not guilty to both charges, and his next court appearance is scheduled for July 5, 2022. Yanira's 3 young children now live with their grandmother, Yanira's mother, Anna, and they deeply miss their mommy.